Welcome to WCAT. I'm Kiki Latimer, and I'm your host for the Catholic Bookworm, where we read to learn, but we share with love in order to understand and hopefully to be transformed in our lives. And this morning, we're discussing a really exciting book called The Immortal Mind, a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul. And I'm happy to have said neurosurgeon with us this morning, Michael Egnor. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
And his co-author, Denyse O'Leary. Welcome, Denyse. And so this is just a topic very dear to me. Was to help teach some of these ideas in a philosophy class with Dr. Stephen Schwartz at the University of Rhode Island for many years. This distinction between the mind and the brain is just dear to my heart. So, Mike, do you want to start us off with a prayer?
I'd be delighted to. Thank you, Kiki. Lord, we thank you for your grace and for all of your gifts and for your beautiful creation. Please bless us and please open our minds to your eternal truths and to understanding your glory as reflected in this creation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. So, for our listeners, our viewers today who are not familiar with the two of you, do you want to start out and tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Yes, sure. I'm a professor of neurosurgery at the Stony Brook University in Long Island, New York. I began my life as an atheist and a materialist. And about 25 years ago, I underwent a religious conversion to Catholicism. And part of that conversion was motivated by what I saw in my practice as a neurosurgeon. When I saw that the human soul exists, that it's a spiritual soul, that there are immaterial aspects of our soul, and that the Christian way of understanding human beings was a much better way to understand human beings scientifically, as well as through our faith. So it all kind of came together that the Catholic faith coincided very, very nicely with what I was seeing in the operating room and what I was seeing in science. So Denyse and I wrote this book to try to tell the public some of the truths that we have seen about the human soul and about the human spirit.
Okay. And Denyse?
Well, I'm a Canadian freelance writer. I was the editor of Mind Matters News, which is an online magazine about mind issues, brain issues, artificial intelligence issues. And Mike was one of our writers on mind and brain issues. Now, years ago, in 2007, I had been the co-author of a book with a neuroscientist in Montreal. And the book was called The Spiritual Brain, a neuroscientist's case for the existence of the soul. Now, you might have thought that that book was just going to sink like a stone, but it didn't. And after a while, I started getting a number of messages from an outfit called academia.edu that Professor Smith and Dr. Jones and so forth had read the book. And I thought, that's interesting. Also, I started to get money from the publisher, royalties, because the book had earned out its advance.
Wow.
But there had been nothing in the meantime. And I thought, well, you know what? What about a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul? Well, an agent grabbed it, and book is what you see, thanks to Mike's ability to get the basic issues across.
And
so there is.
It's one of the things I love about it. It's really written for the layperson. You know, it's you have stories in it, and yet you really dig into the science of it as well. It's just a great balance.
That really was a fundamental goal of ours, is that We really want to communicate to people who are not specialists in this field, either professional philosophers or professional scientists, what we have found in the science and in the everyday clinical practice of neurosurgery, and in philosophical reflection on what all this means. So it was very important to us to communicate these ideas in ways that are accessible to people, because it's the truth, and we want people to understand the truth.
I mean, we're living in this, extremely sort of post-Judeo-Christian world that's very materialistic. And I'm always fascinated by how many people equate the brain and the mind, when to me they're so obviously radically different. And two things that we would point out in class that, always come quickly to mind is one, I know I have a mind, I am a mind, I think with my mind, but except for the fact that science has told me I have a brain, I have absolutely no awareness of my brain.
Right.
I wouldn't even know I had a brain unless somebody told me it,
Right.
I can't feel it, I can't see it, touch it. But I had this intimate experience of my mind.
Well,
That always fascinates me.
well, Kiki, if I could cut in here, the classical world didn't understand that the brain is the organ most closely associated with the mind. People thought the heart was.
Right.
And we see that in our language. That is, people will say things like, as he thinks in his heart, so is he. It was actually a comparatively modern discovery that most of the operation of the body is mediated through the brain, not the heart.
Fascinating. The other thing go ahead.
That's right. I think the most important takeaway from modern neuroscience is that the brain is an organ in many ways just like any other organ in our body, just like our heart or a kidney or a pancreas, in a sense that it has specific jobs to do. It has specific things that it accomplishes for us. And there really are 5 things that the brain does that science clearly shows us. It regulates our physiology. It kind of keeps our hormones straight and keeps our breathing going and our heartbeat at the proper rate. Things like that.
We hope.
If things are working okay. The second thing it does is it allows us to move. It stimulates muscles and allows us to move our limbs and so on. The third thing it does is it allows us to have sensations, to have vision and touch and hearing and things like that. The fourth thing is that it does allow us to have memories. Memories clearly are formed directly because of brain activity. And the fifth thing is that it mediates our emotions. It allows us to feel anger and joy and all these sorts of things. And the science very, very clearly supports that viewpoint. But there is very powerful evidence that the brain does not cause our intellect, which is our capacity to form abstract concepts, our capacity for reason, our capacity to follow a logical sequence of ideas. All of that, while the brain is necessary for the normal exercise of that, doesn't come from the brain. It's an immaterial power that we have. And also the brain is not the source of our free will, that we have free will that's independent from brain function. Interestingly, that was the viewpoint of Aristotle, although he didn't see it as focused on the brain. He didn't understand the role of the brain, but he understood that the body was responsible for a whole series of things, but not for other things. The body was not responsible for the intellect or the will. And St. Thomas Aquinas advanced that idea and described it in more detail. And it turns out that the neuroscience supports that. The neuroscience supports the viewpoint that we have spiritual souls, that part of our soul is brain activity, and that's physical and material. But part of our soul is spiritual, it's not material, and it is the spiritual aspect of us that really makes us human. Our capacity for reason, our capacity for free will, our capacity to contemplate God.
I mean, one of the things you point out connected to the neuroscience is, the possibility of being able to split the brain, and that you don't, obviously wind up with two persons, two spirits, two souls. You still have this unity of person, even if the brain halves are split.
Yes. There's an operation called a corpus callosotomy that's been done since the 1940s. And I've done it, and it's not a common neurosurgical procedure, but there have been thousands of these operations done. And they're done to treat epilepsy that doesn't respond to medication. And it's quite effective. And you cut a very large bundle of nerve fibers that are connecting the two halves of the brain. And what that does is it prevents the epileptic seizure from traveling throughout the entire brain, which makes the seizures much more mild, and makes people's lives much better who have intractable epilepsy. The people who've had that operation have essentially disconnected brain hemispheres. So the left hemisphere has very little connection to the right hemisphere. But these people are perfectly normal in everyday life. They don't feel like two people. They feel completely integrated. If you were to meet them, you couldn't tell the difference. They're perfectly normal people, and they don't feel any different. You can do very detailed scientific research and find some disabilities associated with this disconnection, but these disabilities are perceptual. For example, the left hemisphere of the brain generally allows us to speak. The right hemisphere doesn't give us the ability to speak. So if you present a picture to the right hemisphere, which you can do in split brain patients using their visual fields, if you present a picture to the right hemisphere, they know what it is, but they can't say it. They can only say it if it's presented to the left hemisphere. And a neuroscientist named Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize for showing this back in the early 1980s. However, fascinatingly, many researchers have shown that if you show pictures to each hemisphere separately, one picture to the left hemisphere, one picture to the right hemisphere, people can compare the pictures abstractly, even though no part of the brain has seen both pictures. For example, a person can see a picture of a violin in one hemisphere, a picture of an artist's palette in the other hemisphere, and they can compare them as both being kinds of art, even though no part of their brain has seen both pictures. So there's a part of our mind that's not in our brain, and the neuroscience clearly points to that.
I mean, I always say to students, just wake up at 2 a.m. when you really want to go back to sleep. You know you need to sleep, but your brain is just pumping out like it's on a hamster wheel, with a whatever, not really an idea, just something that, it just won't stop. But you want it to stop. Your mind wants it to stop. You just want to go back to sleep.
Sure.
But your brain is on some kind of a rampage, at 2 a.m.
Yes.
And to me, that's like one of the easiest ways to say to people, one of those things is your brain and the other is your mind, and they're clearly not in sync.
Right.
At 2 a.m.
Yeah. So and actually this idea was expressed in a very clear way by Wilder Penfield, who was a pioneering neurosurgeon back in the 20th century. And he wrote a book called Mystery of the Mind, which I highly recommend if people are interested in this topic. And he really came to the same conclusion that Denyse and I have come to, that the mind is not completely explained by the brain. And the question he asked in his book was, does the brain explain the mind completely? And his answer was no. There are aspects of the mind that are not explained by the brain, and we've come to the same conclusion. And the neuroscience points to it very, very clearly.
I mean, he did those amazing experiments where he'd poke at someone's brain and get them to move their arm.
Yeah.
And then he would say to the person, move your arm, and they could distinguish between I moved my arm or you made my brain move my arm.
Yes.
And that would recognize the difference between those two things.
What he really showed was that when he would do brain surgery on people who were awake, they had local anesthesia so that they didn't feel any pain, and he could stimulate their brains, and he had to map the brain in order to remove tumors or foci of seizures and do it safely, so he didn't damage any critical parts of the brain. So in the brain mapping, he found that he could elicit four things by stimulating the brain. He could cause people to move, he could cause people to have sensations, he could cause people to have memories, and he could cause people to have emotions. But he couldn't cause people to think abstractly. He couldn't cause people to think about arithmetic or calculus or logic or philosophy or any of the kinds of things we're talking about now. You can't get the brain to do by stimulating it, which implies that it's not coming from the brain. The brain is allowing us to express ourselves. And clearly normal brain function is necessary in a sense, but it's not sufficient for that. It comes from something else, which is our immortal soul.
I mean, in the end, Penfield's had, to me, was an amazing idea that rather than the brain enhancing us, the brain limits us, limits the soul.
Yes.
Here and now.
That's a viewpoint that I find absolutely fascinating, and it goes back to a number of philosophers in the 19th century. William James, who was sort of the founder of modern psychology, actually brought this up, that when you look closely at the way the brain and the mind works, it actually makes more sense that the brain focuses the mind. It doesn't generate the mind. That the mind is larger than the brain in kind of a metaphorical sense. And the analogy that some people have used is that it's like a magnifying glass focusing sunlight. That you can take a magnifying glass and focus a beam of sunlight on the ground. And that's what the brain does to the mind. The mind is the sunlight, and the brain is the magnifying glass. But the sunlight is a much bigger thing than just the magnifying glass and the focused beam. That explains in some ways why people who have near-death experiences, when their brain stops working, have much more elaborate mental states. They see beautiful colors. They understand things on a much deeper level. It also explains in some way how mystics reach transcendental states by suppressing their brains. By kind of focusing in a way that gets their brain activity kind of out of the way. It actually expands the mind.
That's an exciting thought, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It seems, in our materialistic culture right now that it's sometimes hard to have conversations about, like, what is consciousness? What is the mind? What is the soul? There's sort of that flippant side of, everybody becomes an angel when they die, and there's just kind of this flippancy to it.
Right.
But when you really try to dig into, like, the mystery of consciousness and the human person, we bump into all kinds of materialistic barriers.
Yes, and the interesting thing, I think, is that the ancients, that is, that the classical theologians, Saint Anselm, Saint Thomas Aquinas, Saint Bonaventure, Saint Augustine, to them this wasn't much of a mystery. I mean, actually the understanding of the human person was much more straightforward. We have spiritual souls, and what we're doing with our spiritual souls, worshiping God, having reason, interacting with the world, makes perfect sense. It became a mystery when modern materialism started trying to understand people as if they were meat robots. The idea that we're just kind of a robot made of meat, we don't have souls, we don't have spirits, then it becomes a mystery as to how the mind can work. But if you cast materialism aside and look at this from a classical Christian theological way of understanding the human person, it's not all that mysterious. We have spiritual souls. We're capable of immaterial powers such as reason and free will, just like we're capable of material things like vision and speech and movement and things like that.
I mean, it fascinates me. For instance, if I think about a pink elephant, right now, think about a pink elephant. The idea sort of seemed to be that, like, if you dug around in the brain long enough, you'd find a little tiny pink elephant.
Right.
And of course, that's not going to happen. You may find the spot what's in the brain that's allowing me to think of the
Precisely.
pink elephant.
Precisely.
But you're not
Precisely.
going to find the little pink elephant in there. No matter how far down you get in there, there's not going to be a little pink elephant.
Precisely.
And it amazes me that when I, would discuss this with students, they were shocked by that. They were like, well, yeah, but there's the idea in there. And it's like, well, yeah, but the idea can't be in a physical thing. An idea is a spiritual thing.
Precisely. Precisely. And in it, another interesting way to look at it is that if you think of a triangle, if I were to ask you what a triangle is, there are two ways you could sort of answer that question. One would be just to have a mental picture of what a triangle looks like, just based on what you've seen drawn on a piece of paper. But mental pictures are never actually triangles, meaning that a triangle is a very specific, exact thing. It's a plane figure with three sides that's closed and exactly straight sides, and the internal angles add to 180 degrees. We can conceive of that exactly, but there's nothing in our brain that could make an exact triangle. There's no exactness. So our capacity to understand exactly what something is can't be in the brain, because the brain can't do exact things. The brain is just a piece of meat. We can think about infinity. Any number that you can name, I can name a higher number just by adding one to it.
Mm.
But so how can a finite organ like the brain that weighs 3 pounds, it's got dimensions, allow us to think of an infinite number of numbers? So clearly we have a spiritual aspect to us that is not material and is not in the brain.
It's just, there's so much that's fascinating about the human person. The unity of consciousness compared to, the brain is kind of it's this thing, which obviously consciousness is not.
Yes, the perhaps technical term for that unity is called metaphysical simplicity. And what that means is that you can't divide a person's consciousness. You can't, for example, your consciousness or your mind, you can't have like one part of your mind is in your bedroom, but the other part of your mind is in the kitchen. It can't be split that way. But the brain is something that can be split. You can have a part of the brain that's split off. The brain has different, it has parts that have locations. The mind isn't like that. The mind is a metaphysically simple thing. So the mind is something that is not fully explained by the brain itself.
One of the things you get into in your book, which was really fascinating, I guess in chapter 2, how much brain does a mind need? And you have so many cases of people that have very little actual brain material, yet function perfectly normally.
Yes, and that was one of the things that led us to this viewpoint about the mind-brain relationship, is that I've had many patients over the years who have very deficient brains, sometimes missing half or 2/3 of their brain, who really function quite normally. Now that doesn't mean it's a good idea to lose part of your brain, because that can cause a very serious deficit. But the connection between the anatomy of the brain and the state of the mind is not nearly as tight as one might think. That you tend to think that your brain is like a computer, and with a computer, if you take a chainsaw to your computer and you cut off a big part of your computer, it's not going to work well and probably won't work at all. That's not the way the brain works. About half of the brain can be removed in various ways, and people can still have very good function. So the link between the mind and the brain is not the same as the link between a computer and computation. It's a different thing, the materialist way of understanding the mind as being completely a product of the brain is a scientific proposition against which I think there's a lot of evidence that does not support the materialistic way of understanding the mind and the brain.
Mhm. I've followed the stories of quite a number of conjoined twins over the years, with questions about the metaphysics, but I had not heard about Krista and Tatiana, which is an amazing story in your book.
Yes.
Because they share brain areas. I mean, we hear a lot of conjoined twins, but they usually have two heads, two upper bodies, and they're trying to figure out how to share, limbs. But Tatiana and Krista are a very unique situation.
In a way, they're the flip side of the coin with split brain patients. Instead of their brains being split, their brains are fused. And they share many things. Their brains are connected because they're joined at the head, and they share vision. They can see out of each other's eyes, at least partially. They share sensation. If you touch one girl's leg, the other girl can feel it as well. They share movement. They can share movement of limbs, and they can share emotions. But
That's amazing to me.
absolutely, it's absolutely fascinating, and how it works. It's fascinating. But it's because those parts of their brains,
too.
that those parts of their brains are connected. However, they don't seem to share. They certainly don't share personalities. They have differences of opinion. They have fights. They have different free will. Each one has their own free will. They don't appear to share intellect. That is, that there's no evidence, for example, that one girl can study calculus and understand it, and the other girl will understand it without studying it. So there are aspects of their minds that are very different, and there are some aspects of their minds that are fused. And that is very much in keeping with what St. Thomas Aquinas said about the way the mind and brain work. That again, the ability to move, the ability to have sensations, the ability to remember, and the ability to have emotions are brain related, and you can share that, but you can't share abstract reasoning, and you can't share free will, because those are different powers of the soul.
So it really speaks to there being two persons.
Yes, totally. They're totally two persons. They share, in some sense, just like if they were joined at the hip and they shared their kidneys. You share they share an organ, they share a brain, but they only share certain powers of the mind and not other powers of the mind. And the powers of the mind they do share do come from the brain. But there are other powers of the mind, like the intellect and like the will, that don't come from the brain, and they don't share those powers.
And those are the powers that really is wherein we find moral responsibility and choice.
Precisely.
Of what kind of person do I want to be?
Yes. Moral reasoning is entirely intellect and will. Intellect is that by which we comprehend what's morally right and wrong, and will is that by which we act on our moral decisions. And that's entirely a spiritual aspect of human beings. It can be influenced by the brain. That is, if we're intoxicated, we may make different moral choices. But the actual choice, or the actual reasoning and the actual choice, doesn't come from the brain. It's a spiritual power of human beings.
And spiritual powers that are really necessary for the human person.
In some sense, they define the human person. And this goes all the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle defined human beings as rational animals. That is, we are animals in a sense. That we have organs, and we have skin, and we have all kinds of animal things in us. And there's a lot of similarity physically between humans and animals, and we share some psychological things with animals. Animals have vision. We have vision. Animals have emotions. We have emotions. All of that. But what animals don't have that we have is the capacity for abstract thought, for reasoning, for forming concepts, and for having free will. Animals have appetites, but that's not free will. And my dog has an appetite for eating bacon, but he doesn't have the free will to choose not to eat bacon because it will violate his diet. He doesn't think about diets. He just wants to eat the bacon.
You spend quite a bit of time in the book, Denyse, too. I want to bring you in here on near-death experiences. Why? I mean, and a lot of people are very interested in near-death experiences. It's always a good way in to get conversation going because people are fascinated by them.
Well, there have been some changes in recent decades around the study of near-death experiences. At one time, it was the sort of thing that was associated with paranormal stuff, seances, mediums, and so forth. But the advent of high-tech medicine meant that people could be in an intensive care unit, right? And be popping in and out of various states of death. And so then maybe the person doesn't quite die permanently, right? Even though if you look at the readings on the machines, it doesn't look good, but somehow or other they're brought back. And that person says, I had this tremendous experience. And by the way, doctor, your toupee is on crooked. That's the veridical near-death experience where the person who has the experience sees things that he or she should not have been able to see.
Right.
Especially not if one is clinically dead. If they unhook the machines, that person would just be dead, right? The machines are keeping the person going. Okay, well, so suddenly it's not the medium's parlor anymore. It's people writing articles in medical journals about what they've discovered in these situations. And they're treated with respect. And I pointed out to Mike about a year and a half ago or so, it's curious that so many doctors want their names on these papers. I can remember when it was one or two who were willing to be the outliers walking on the wild side. Now it's something that you can study, right? Because if somebody says, well, that's just nonsense, there's got to be a materialist explanation for it, I would say, well, explain the veridical near-death experiences if you want. Be our guest. You may discover something that nobody knew before that's material. Okay, that's possible. But in the meantime, we have to work with what we have. And so I think that changed the picture a lot. Mike could say something perhaps about the Pam Reynolds case, which may have been a watershed case. It involved neurosurgery.
Yes, the Pam Reynolds case was a fascinating case, and I think it's I think of it as the ultimate challenge that materialists have in explaining near-death experiences is what I sort of call the Pam Reynolds challenge. Pam Reynolds was a woman who relatively young woman in her 30s who began having severe headaches and was found to have a very large aneurysm at the base of her brain, which was like a balloon in a critical blood vessel feeding her brainstem. And it was under ordinary circumstances not treatable when this happened, which was back in 1991. And the expectation was that it would rupture soon and she would die. There is a neurosurgeon in Phoenix, Dr. Robert Spetzler, who's the world's expert on this kind of aneurysm, who had developed a very radical operation to fix the aneurysm, and Ms. Reynolds agreed to undergo the surgery, and he called it a standstill procedure. The difficulty was that this aneurysm was a ballooning of this critical blood vessel, and Dr. Spetzler had to go in surgically and open up the aneurysm and repair the blood vessel with the blood vessel wide open, which means that there couldn't be any blood flowing, because if the blood was flowing, she would bleed to death. So he had to stop her heart and stop the blood flowing to her brain to fix the aneurysm, and to do that in a way that didn't kill her permanently. He took her to the operating room. He put her under anesthesia. They then cooled her body down to about 6 degrees Fahrenheit, so her brain was more tolerant of this kind of thing. And then they put her on a heart-lung machine, and they stopped her heart. And they stopped her heart for about 30 minutes. And during those 30 minutes, Dr. Spetzler actually tipped the operating table up, drained the blood out of her brain, opened the artery, fixed the artery, and then they restarted her heart, restarted the blood flowing, brought her body temperature back up to normal, and brought her out of anesthesia. The operation took about 6 hours. It went very well. And in recovery, she woke up, she was doing fine. And then she told him that she watched the operation while he was doing it. And he was incredulous. He said, well, you couldn't have watched the operation. You were under anesthesia, you were under surgical drapes, you couldn't see anything, and you were brain dead. You had no blood flow in your brain at all. And then she described what conversations he had, what his instruments looked like, what the other doctors in the room did and said, and what music was playing on the radio during the surgery. She said that what happened was when her heart stopped, she felt herself pop out of her body, float up to the ceiling, come over Spetzler's shoulder, and watch the surgery from over his shoulder. She said her vision was beautiful, that it was incredibly clear. The whole thing was very clear. And then she saw a tunnel, the proverbial tunnel, and she felt herself being drawn down the tunnel. She went into the tunnel, and at the other end of the tunnel was a beautiful scene, a beautiful world, with her deceased grandparents there. And she talked with them. She had experiences on that side. They all agreed that she had to come back to life because she had 3 children to raise. So she came back down the tunnel and popped back into her body. And she said that when she popped back into her body, it felt like she was diving into a pool of ice water, which is true because her body temperature was 60 degrees. The remarkable thing about this near-death experience is that her brain was meticulously monitored during this process. So it is almost like it was a laboratory experiment. Her brain waves were completely absent. There was no brain function. There wasn't even any blood in her brain during this time that she was aware fully of what was going on in the room. So in some sense, it's the biggest challenge to people who deny the reality of near-death experiences. And I think that to explain near-death experiences, any theory, whether it's materialistic or non-materialistic, has to account for 4 things. It has to account for the fact that what people experience in near-death experiences are very clear, very organized, highly rational. It's not like you lack oxygen and you just have hallucinations. This is very clear, rational thinking. The second thing is that many people in near-death experiences have out-of-body experiences where they see accurately what's happening around them when they're dead. The third thing is that when people go down the tunnel and meet people on the other side, the people they meet are always dead people. There's never living people there. For example, if you go down the tunnel, if your mom is still alive, you don't meet your mom. If your mom has passed away, you may meet your mom. They've even had situations where people were in car accidents with other people in the car who were taken to other hospitals. And if one of the people had a near-death experience, the only people they'd meet at the other end of the tunnel were the people in the car accident who died, not the ones who lived. And they didn't know who lived or died.
Right. That's fascinating. I didn't know that. I
Yeah.
thought, I sort of did, but I never really thought about it before.
There are a number of instances, both with car accidents and with other circumstances, where people see dead people at the other end of the tunnel that they didn't know in life were dead.
Wow.
That had passed away like a day or two before, and the word hadn't gotten to them. And the fourth reason that thing that people have to explain is that near-death experiences are very often transformative. People who have near-death experiences become very different people, usually much more spiritual. And there's no materialist explanation for these experiences that can explain all these 4 things. And obviously, there's no materialist explanation that can explain what happened to Pam Reynolds.
It's amazing. It's an amazing story. You asked
So much.
Go ahead.
So much is that the case that 2 prominent skeptics of near-death experiences, Michael Shermer and Susan Blackmore, have cautioned their followers not to just dump on and scoff at them. They're saying, look, it's gone beyond the point where you can just laugh at this stuff. We believe that a materialist explanation will be found. But in the meantime, you're just going to look foolish when you have to deal with something like the Pam Reynolds case.
Right. And it's been estimated that between 9 and 20 million Americans have had near-death experiences. So this is not rare. This happens it's like 3 to 5% of the population has had these experiences. And about 20% of the people who have these experiences have experiences that can be corroborated, that can be verified. That is, you have the near-death experience, you see something when you were dead that can be checked and proven. You see something going on in the room. There have even been studies, and I find this fascinating. Some people have looked at people who've had cardiac arrest and divided the people with cardiac arrest into two groups: the ones who had near-death experiences where they saw things in the room, and the ones who didn't have near-death experiences. And not everybody who has cardiac arrest has a near-death experience. The people who had the near-death experiences have much more accurate knowledge about what happens during a resuscitation than people who didn't have near-death experiences. So the knowledge that people have of what happens to them during the resuscitation when they have a near-death experience is not from general knowledge. It's not from watching TV, because the other people watch TV too. It's a special knowledge that's because they actually saw what happened around them.
I've heard that in some operating rooms now, they're like the staff will put a photograph of something on a top shelf, like
Yes.
on one of the top shelves, like a
Yes.
picture of a hamster or a red ball or something. And then when someone does have a near-death experience, they'll say, well, what was the picture of them for?
Right.
And they'll
Yeah, there's
tell them.
well, no, actually, no one has passed that test yet. Actually,
I
that's
heard
the
that someone had seen something up there on the top.
well, people have seen things definitely on top, but not with that test. That test, as far as I know, unless there's something new, that test was devised by Sam Parnia, who actually is an acquaintance of mine. I used to work with him. He's a brilliant guy. He's written extensively on near-death experiences, and Sam wanted to use that as a test. And so far, no one has had he's had people who've had near-death experiences, but when they were out of their body, they weren't in a position to see what was on top of the machines. However, other people have seen what's on top of machines. Not in Sam's experiments.
Okay.
People can read serial numbers on machines that were not visible to them. So people have seen things like that. But the experiments where it's prospective, where they put the signs up there, as far as I know, no one has seen that yet.
Okay. You also Alzheimer's. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say maybe that would make sense. If I had a chance to see my grandparents again, I don't think I would care what picture of a monkey or something that they put up there.
Right. Right.
I like, it may be that what's actually happening to the person is not something where they would care. That's all I mean.
Right.
When it does happen, it's accidental. I recall, I think it was Dr. Parnia, in one case, the near-death experiencer had reported that he'd heard a mechanical voice in the room saying, shock the patient, shock the patient.
Right.
Now, it turns out that was an automated instruction given on, I believe, a defibrillator.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So he really did hear something that was doubtless what everyone else was hearing when he was having the near-death experience. But I don't know if they put a picture on the wall. He might not have seen that anyway.
Right. Right. I mean, when people have near-death experiences, they don't see everything. I mean, they don't see every surface of every machine in the room and so on. Their vision is usually limited in some sense. But there have been many people who have seen things on the top of machines near the ceiling and serial numbers and so on. But in the particular study that Dr. Parnia did, that hasn't happened yet. But it has happened in previous studies.
You also mentioned sudden clarity during Alzheimer's, like you called it paradoxical lucidity. These moments of clarity when someone's brain is obviously very, deficient, has severe problems, but suddenly there's mind clarity.
My father had a number of those incidents when in his last years, he had dementia. But every so often, he would become clear as a bell. And I quoted one of the examples in the book. Most of them I couldn't quote because you'd have to know the context of a Canadian family to realize what he was talking about. But in one case, it was quite easy to guess what he was talking about, just for a reader without too much explanation. But yes, and one of my concerns is it may be much more common than we think because people tend to stop visiting people who have dementia. Then suddenly they hear, Grandpa is dying. The doctors don't think he'll live more than a few days. So they, of course, rush to stay by Grandpa's bedside. And guess what? As he's passing away, he says some lucid things, and that's called terminal lucidity.
Amazing.
But my question would be, if you'd been there more often, you might have seen this before. I don't know. You see, I visited my father every day. That's why I saw many such instances. But now, Mike, did you say that one of the doctors who studies this isn't that happy with the distinction between terminal and paradoxical lucidity?
Yeah, Stephen Post is a good friend of mine. He's one of the senior people in the medical ethics organization at Stony Brook, and Stephen actually has written a book on this, and he's very interested in this topic, and he just points out that although there are many instances in which this period of lucid mental stuff can immediately precede death. It doesn't necessarily precede death. That is, that if your loved one suddenly in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's is capable for half an hour of speaking with you fairly normally, it doesn't mean they're going to die the next day. So he says that paradoxical lucidity probably is a better explanation. It's not necessarily a terminal event, although not infrequently it is, but it's not necessarily so.
I did some respite care for a husband and wife. The wife had gotten Alzheimer's in her 40s, very early, and she was now in her 70s, and Barbara was completely nonverbal the several weeks. I mean, by the time I met her, she was nonverbal, and needed to be fed and, toileted, and, so it was a very limited situation. But I was convinced from the moment I met her that she was sort of in there somewhere. Mm-hmm. And, she wouldn't do much of anything, but if she heard like a man-woman joke, she would laugh. If a joke came on the TV, or my sister visited with me and we made some joke. I remember one point she was sort of, seemingly comatose on the couch. And I yelled from one end of the house to the other to my sister. I said, I can't find any pasta in the kitchen. There's 500 rolls of paper towels, but that man doesn't have one box of pasta. And Barbara started laughing on the couch. I was like, and so I always treated her as if she were there. I was convinced she was in there. And eventually, her husband kept her at home as long as he could, but eventually she was moved to a nursing home, and they lived quite a number of hours away from me, so I didn't see her regularly. But about a year later, I did go to visit her in the nursing home, and I climbed into the bed with her and just hugged her. And then her husband got there and they moved her to the wheelchair and we chatted for a bit, and I could only stay for about a half hour, maybe an hour. But she clearly was agitated, when she saw me, and I was like, I was just absolutely convinced that she knew who I was. And when it came time to say goodbye, I said, I have to go. And she kind of was like, so I'm like, she's in there. And I leaned over and I kissed her goodbye. and clear as a bell, the only words she ever spoke to me, she whispered in my ear, "I love you." And it was, wow. The only word she ever spoke directly to me, "I love you." It was just beautiful. I mean, such a gift. And I shared that at her funeral a year later, because there were a lot of people there at the funeral connected to the Alzheimer's in that area. And I just really wanted to encourage them, like, your loved one is in there. The brain
Yeah.
is having a problem, but the mind is there. And
Well, a similar thing has been found in people who are in deep coma. Actually, even beyond coma, it's called persistent vegetative state, which is really when there's been very severe brain damage, and they're just barely better than brain death. And these people can be studied in MRI machines, where activation patterns in what's left of their brain can be used as ways of communicating with them. About 40% of people in persistent vegetative state, you can talk with them using these patterns of activation. You can ask them questions, and based on the activation pattern, you get a rational answer. People can actually have relatively deep thoughts, even in the deepest level of coma. And so, yes, what it implies is that question that Wilder Penfield asked many years ago, does the brain explain the mind completely? The answer is no. That is, that even with severe brain damage from head trauma, from a stroke, from Alzheimer's, the mind can be much, much better than that, which implies that we have spiritual souls that don't entirely come from our brains.
You made the statement, which I thought was really beautiful. What if the soul does not die but cannot die?
Yeah. The argument for that actually traces back to the ancients. It traces back, Thomas Aquinas made a very powerful argument about this, that when you think about what it means to die, what we think of by dying is really a process of disintegration, not of ceasing to exist. For example, one could metaphorically say that a chair could die. How would a chair die? Well, if you reduce the chair to sawdust and blow the sawdust into the wind, well, there's no more chair there, right? But all the atoms that were in the chair still exist. They're just in the sawdust. They just go places. When an animal dies, the animal's body decomposes. But every atom in that animal's body is still present. It's just not formed as a body. When we die, our bodies will decompose. But the question is, can the soul die? Can the soul we have die? And the soul has immaterial powers, spiritual powers. And spirits can't disintegrate. They can't break up into parts and go off into the wind. An analogy for thinking about this is if you think about the number 8, and you think about two ways that the number 8 can exist. It can exist as something drawn on a piece of paper with ink, or it can exist as a concept, as something spiritual. On a piece of paper, ink with the letter 8 written, that can cease to exist. That can die metaphorically. If you put it into a fireplace, it gets burned up, it goes to ash. But the number 8 itself, the spiritual conceptual number 8, it can't die. That is, no mathematician is going to say, well, I regret to announce that the number 8 died yesterday, so we have to count from 7 to 9 now. The things that are not material, like the human soul, can't disintegrate. So we're naturally immortal. Our souls, by their very nature, can't die. So our bodies die, but our souls go on. And we believe as Christians that the Lord reconstitutes our body, and that we are reanimated, resurrected with a resurrection body. But the science is quite consistent with the classical Christian and even Catholic view of what happens in the afterlife.
There's so much in your book. It's just really, really delightful. Wonderful, beautiful stories. You have your conversion story in there. Do you want to share it a little bit? It's such an amazing
Sure.
story.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, I start out in life as a materialist and as an atheist. I was never an angry atheist. I always thought Christians were nice people, and I thought Christianity was a very beautiful story. But I thought it was a myth. I didn't think it was true. And I began to question all that, and as I got older, as I had a family, I began to think, gee, I don't know why I'm here, where I'm coming from, where I'm going, all these deep questions, and materialism didn't seem to have much of an answer for them. But I still wasn't ready to convert to Christianity. When my youngest son was born, my wife and I were concerned when he was a very young infant that he had autism. He wasn't making eye contact, he wasn't smiling. And that terrified me, the thought that he would not know me, that he was separated from me in the way that severely autistic children can be, really was breaking my heart. So when he was about 6 months old, I was working one night at a Catholic hospital, and was just going through a difficult emotional time. So I went to the chapel in the hospital, and I prayed. I was alone in the chapel at night, and
No atheists in foxholes, right?
right. Everybody eventually says a prayer if they're in a tough enough spot. And I said, God, I don't know if you exist. I all my life have believed that you don't exist. But if you do exist, please take this away from me. I can't have a child who doesn't know me, a child who's separated from me with autism. And I heard a voice, only time in my life I've ever heard a voice like this. And the voice said, but that's what you're doing to me. And I realized that he was showing me how he was feeling. That I was his child, and I was separated from him and didn't know him, and it was painful to him. So I collapsed. I told him, I won't do it to you anymore, I promise. And so the next day I went to the church and said, how do I get baptized like really quick? And had to go through RCIA, all that stuff. And a couple days later, my son had his 6-month birthday party, and he was perfectly normal. He was smiling and making eye contact, and perfectly normal child. So I realized that the Lord had spoken to me, and as He did with parables in the Gospels, He was showing me. He was giving me an example of what it's like to not be loved by your child, or to not be known by your child. And so I promised him I wouldn't do that to him anymore, and that's what I'm trying to do.
A beautiful story. I cried when I read it in the book. And I was reading out loud to my husband, and I didn't expect that to happen. And I could only get through it. And hearing you share it now, it's just really beautiful to see how our God does work with us to bring us home.
Yeah, I think he speaks to each of us individually, because of course he created us, and he knows us better than we know ourselves. And to me, the way he commonly speaks to me is he shows me things. Like I'll have a question in prayer that I want answered, and over the next day or so, I'll encounter something in everyday life that provides the answer. I'll see that, oh, that's what he means. That's, and but I think he speaks to each of us in a way that is meaningful to us.
Beautiful. Denyse, what did you love most about working on this book? Mike.
The way in which the issues have developed over the years. See, remember, I started working on a book in 2005, a predecessor book of a sort, The Spiritual Brain. And the way it started was, I was at a science writers conference, and a prominent Canadian science writer flagged me down. And he said, you've got to help me. There's this project a neuroscientist wants me to take on, but it goes against everything I believe. And I said, okay, look, it's my problem. It's not your problem. Go away. Have a good time. Get the agent to contact me. I'll meet Mario. We will work something out. And we did. It was The Spiritual Brain. But that was the attitude back then. No respectable person would touch the idea that there was anything to the mind that couldn't be fully explained by the brain. Well, was it last week, Mike? Michael Shermer, a noted skeptic, released his video of Mike and a prominent neuroscientist, Christoph Koch. And it was a very respectful conversation. You might have thought that they were going to go after Mike, like, this idiot actually believes such and such. Nothing of the sort. Now, Christoph Koch made clear that he entirely disagreed with Mike's interpretation of events, but he did so in a respectful way. And that's very much changed from the days when Mario was terrified he wasn't going to get his PhD. So I think there's no doubt that there is a change. People are looking at these things with a much more open mind. It may not last, but we should do what we can while we can, right?
All right. Yeah, there's a
realism.
I think there is increasingly and at least a little bit of an openness to this way of looking at the science, basically because materialism has failed so completely to explain the mind and the brain with anything approaching rigor. I think thoughtful, open-minded neuroscientists, for example, Dr. Koch, I think are beginning to see that we have to change our perspective on this. And the argument we make in the book is that if you accept that the intellect and the will are immaterial powers of the soul, a lot of things in neuroscience really begin to make sense, and make sense in a very clear and straightforward way. And I think for the two things that I really enjoyed in writing this book, first of all, is working with Denyse. It has been an absolute privilege, and we've worked together on various projects for like 15 years, and it's just been wonderful. The other thing I really liked is the idea that we can take this science and this philosophy, which is rather specialized and so on, and make it available to regular people, to people in the working world, and people, our neighbors and our friends, because people walk around so often with this idea that our spiritual understandings, that our religious beliefs, our Catholic, our Christian beliefs, are separate from the world of science, that the science is kind of the enemy, that they're and the reality is, when you look at the science in a thoughtful, accurate way, the science very much supports the Christian understanding of man, that science is not our enemy. There are some scientists who don't see things very clearly, who are materialists and who are mistaken. But the science itself is pointing to the truth, and the truth is what the church teaches about human beings.
Really beautiful to see science, is really just able to just come together with faith. Sure. And the two do mesh beautifully together when you're open to seeing that truth.
Yes, yes. And what I'd love to do is to have scientists come to see that they're not threatened by this. That is, that you can do great neuroscience and accept the spiritual nature of the soul. It doesn't mean that science is ended by that. Science is expanded by that. There's even more to learn. There's a young scientist named Matthew Owen, who actually was a young colleague of Dr. Koch's, who has written about this, and he is open to the Aristotelian way of understanding the human soul, which has immaterial powers. And so this idea is starting to percolate out in the scientific community. And we're hoping that our book will help with that. But our main goal in the book is just to tell the public that the science supports the Christian understanding of man. And we hope that we've been able to do that effectively.
I think you've done an amazing job. I think it's a wonderful book, very accessible to the layperson, to the general public. The Immortal Mind, a Neurosurgeon's Case for the Existence of the Soul. You both just, it's just wonderful. It's delightful, your personal stories, the things you've shared. You've brought a lot of scientific concepts into very easy language for people that are not familiar with the science. You've made it understandable. Is there we've meandered all over the place here. Is there anything you'd like to add? And then we'll certainly want to talk about where people can get the book, but is there something important that you'd like to mention? Denyse?
Well, I think that people reading popular science, articles in popular science magazines, may still run into a lot of what's called promissory materialism. As in, one of these days, we're going to find out the exact circuit in the brain that causes people to give to charity. The exact cells that cause them to tell the truth in the courtroom. One of these days. Now, decades pass, nothing happens except that a non-materialist approach to these things becomes more and more obvious and inevitable, but the science writing goes on as if it was some kind of a script. People feel they have to say these things, because if they don't say them, they're not being scientific. And my thought on the subject is, if you're saying things that don't appear to conform to what you're actually seeing, that's not scientific. I don't know what you're doing, but it's not science. So, because science is about what you can actually document. And so far, they haven't found the circuit in the brain or the cells in the brain that do any of those things because they're not there. Now, what it'll take to get people, I'm not telling them they have to believe what Mike and I believe. I'm just saying, can you just start by not insisting that one of these days we're going to reduce it to that? You don't have to do that. You can just report what you found.
Just start with that. Well, I think it's even, not even higher levels of what chooses you to give to charity, but going back to my pink elephant, like you may find in the brain what allows me to have that thought, what, that my brain, what part of my brain I use, but you won't find the pink elephant in there. You won't find,
Right.
even if, I always think, well, even if you were to find this minuscule pink elephant in there, that's not what I'm seeing.
Right.
That's not what I'm thinking.
Right.
You probably need neurosurgery.
Right.
If you had stuff like that in your brain, I don't think it would be good for you.
And
Asking a student once, there was a fan on the other side of the room, and I said, "Where do you see that fan?" And she said, "I see it in my mind. I see it in my brain." And I said, "You don't see it across the room, you see it in your brain." I said, "If you see that fan in your brain, you need neurosurgery."
Right. Well, it's actually dark. It's dark inside your brain. There's no light in there. You're inside your skull, so you couldn't see it anyway. Yeah, yeah. Once one.
Well, that's good. I didn't think there's no light in there. So
there's no light in there anyway. Yeah, it's dark. Yeah, you need a flashlight. So yeah, the whole materialist idea, I think, is just a mistake. It's just bad. It's just bad science, and it's bad logic. And I think that we can do much better science, neuroscience, and other kinds of science, by opening our minds. And what we found, what Denyse and I have found over the years, is that the Christian understanding of man, of human beings, leads to the best science. That the spiritual soul is real, and when you acknowledge that, so many things in science make a lot more sense.
Amazing book, The Immortal Mind. Where can people get your book, guys?
Amazon, good bookstores, Barnes and Noble. Like there are a number of places. If you just went to the nav bar and typed Immortal Mind, you'd be offered a number of options.
And it's available in hardcover, it's available on Kindle, and it's available on audiobook. The gentleman who does the reading on audiobook is excellent. I actually, is wonderful to listen to.
Oh, that's always good. There's nothing worse than a bad reader of a good
Right. This guy's really good. They actually gave Denyse and I a whole choice of people, and we listened to them, and he's the best. So
That's awesome. You get this.
It's also available in the large print edition.
Oh, good. For those of us with a brain that's not functioning with the vision.
Well,
right.
More the eyes, maybe.
Right.
This has just been really, really wonderful. Just really recommend this. This is a real gem of a book. So, Denise, do you want to end us with a prayer?
Sure. Almighty Father, who have brought us to the beginning of this day, keep us in the truth of your holy word. Help us to imitate your Son in everything we think, say, or do, and come at last to the kingdom. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
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 Again, thank you both so much. Do you have another book in the works? Do you have anything else you're working on?
Stay tuned.
Okay.
Yes.
There's been discussion.
Yeah, we're talking about it. We're very excited by all of this stuff, and we have a lot of ideas.
Well, stay in touch, please. I'd love to chat with you both again.
Thank you. Thank you, Kiki.
Happy for it.
Thank you. God bless.
God bless you.